All right, everyone. Welcome to today's meeting. We have Nora with us today from Admissions Helpers, and she's going to be going over some personal statement stuff, which is really exciting. And I'm just going to do like the meeting information that you'll need to know in the recap email. So don't need to worry about that for right now. But Nora, thank you so much for being here. And yeah, you can take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Um, so like Gigi mentioned, my name's Nora. I work as a PA. I've been a PA now for almost 4 years. Um, First started in Chicago, now living in New York and working on an inpatient leukemia unit, and did the same thing in Chicago, now just living here and doing that. So any questions that you have about being a PA, I'm also open to those. Obviously, we'll talk the bulk of this about PA admissions, and we'll go a little bit in detail about the personal statement, like Gigi mentioned. But I always like to tell you guys that I do work as a PA, so I can answer kind of any questions about that as well. Um, Very open to questions throughout. If you guys want to raise your hand or just interrupt me and stop me and have, if you have a question about something specific. Um, I do apologize. I did not go to school during the Zoom era, so I don't know actually how, um, if someone raises their hand or has a question because I'm sharing my screen, I don't know if I can see that. So anyway, if you do, just feel free to interrupt me and just chime in. I it's this should I want this to be as helpful for you guys as possible. And I want you guys to get the most out of it. So don't don't hesitate to interrupt and just ask whatever questions you have. So anyway, that's kind of a little disclaimer, but we'll just go ahead and dive into things. So obviously we're going to be talking about PA school admissions today. Like Gigi mentioned, we'll also go a little bit into depth about the personal statement. The admissions helpers website is there at the bottom, and I'll also have a contact slide at the end for you guys to write down our information if you have additional questions after this session or want um, to know more about the services we offer and everything like that. So how we wait, okay. So the way that we sort of the way, at least for me as an admissions consultant for PA admissions, how I sort of guide students is you want to sort of think backwards. So obviously you're putting all this time and effort into your application, and so you want to think, how do admissions committees think? How are they going to be looking at my application? What are they going to be? How are they going to be breaking it down? How are they going to categorize me into a student that they want to give an interview to, into a student that they want to accept, put on the wait list, reject, whatever. And so obviously you want to avoid being rejected, but how do you fit, and how are they thinking about where you fit into those different categories? So the analogy that we have sort of come up with as a way for students to think about how they're going to be categorized is drawing a parallel to a patient coming in. So a patient comes into you with shortness of breath. And so how do you determine, can they just go home? Are they fine? Do I need to admit them to the floor? Do I need to do more testing? Do I need to ask them more questions? Or are they unstable? Do they need to be intubated? Do I need to admit them to the ICU? So those are kind of the three different buckets when you're like triaging a patient. And so how admissions committees sort of triage their students and think about who they're offering interviews to, who they're accepting, et cetera, that you would fall into obviously these three buckets. So are they going to throw your application in the trash? Do you not even meet their requirements? Do you not meet their standards? And so are they not going to give you a second look? Are they going to, do you meet all their standards, but do they want to know more? And are they going to consider you to review you further after they kind of look at everyone else that's applied? Or for sure, do they really like you? Do you exceed their standards? Do you come off as a really good fit for their program? Do they want to invite you for an interview? So those are kind of the three different things, or different kind of ways that application or admissions committees review applications. So how do they determine which category that you fall into? And so they look at different data points. So your GPA, your test scores, obviously your GPA, that is further broken down into your overall GPA and then also your science GPA. So a lot of students think, oh, I have a really great GPA. I have a 3.8 GPA or 3.9, 4.0 GPA. But when you actually look at the classes that they've taken majority like fluff classes or easy A's or like the one credit classes that everyone kind of throws in here and there. But when you just break down their science courses, like their biochem, organic chemistry, anatomy, physiology, they're getting mostly B minuses, C's in those classes. And so that actual only those classes, that GPA is a lot lower. And so a lot of students sometimes forget about that and don't really consider that and look at their mostly overall. Whereas your science GPA is actually really important and is actually one of the that's kind of how they look at your GPA. So that's really important. Your test scores are going to be your GRE scores, which I'm sure you all are familiar with what the GRE is. A lot of schools are GRE optional now. It's sort of phasing out as a test that's required for PA school. I work with students a lot who are like, hey, I'm a bad test taker. I'm going to avoid this if I can, and end up getting into multiple programs and having a great option of kind of where they want to go. So it's not for sure that you have to take the GRE, but that's something that is a little bit newer because they're phasing it out. When I applied to PA school, I had to take the GRE. It was more common back then. But the other test that they're requiring now, or some schools are requiring now, is the PA CAT. So that's modeled after the MCAT, and it's actually a knowledge-based exam that's more applicable to PA school. So in my opinion, probably a better judgment of how someone's going to do in PA school rather than the GRE, because the stuff you have to study for the GRE isn't applicable to PA school. But not all schools are requiring it. It's a newer test. I don't know where you guys are all at in terms of your schooling and kind of where you're at in the application process. But if you're applying within the next year, 2 years, even 3 years, that test might be more common. So you'll have to look out for that and study for that, as it'll be required for your application. So those are kind of the academic things. And then on top of the academic things, there's obviously your patient care experience or your clinical hours, direct patient care experience. Common ways that students will get that is going to be CNA, EMT, medical assistant, physical therapy aide, medical scribe, things like that. There's obviously a ton of other things in between all of those, but those are, I would say, the most common ways that people get patient care experience. And then there's going to be your PA shadowing hours. Two things about shadowing hours. So one being that it's important to obviously shadow a PA because you want to know what you're getting yourself into. It's also important to shadow a PA because you want to develop a relationship with them that they can eventually write a letter of recommendation for you, which is something to keep in mind. And then also with PA shadowing, a lot of times students will get shadowing hours in primary care or sorry, not in primary care, but in a specialty, because they either know a PA in that specialty or whatever. But it's important to get primary care experience in either your patient care experience or your PA shadowing. A lot of schools put an emphasis on that in their applications and kind of like students who have more of those hours. So that's just something to mention as well. Okay, does working as a caregiver count as patient care hours? Yes. So that is anything that you do that's directly involving patients and directly caring for patients counts as patient care hours. We'll get to it in a couple slides, but we'll go over how to kind of fill out your CASPA, including all your different patient care experiences and kind of what to include in order to get the most out of your experience. And so we'll get into that a little bit later. And if you have more questions, we can definitely get into those. Or I can definitely like answer more specifically if you have any questions. And then does shadowing an MD count for hours as well? So shadowing an MD counts for shadowing hours, but it's not looked at the same as PA shadowing hours. So a lot of times that's actually a really good question because a lot of students will be like, oh, well, great. I have 50 shadowing hours. And they only shadowed an MD. And that's just for your general experience and your general knowledge. I guess it kind of helps, but if you're applying to PA school, it doesn't matter that you shadowed an MD. It would be the same as you shadowing a nurse or a nurse practitioner or an occupational therapist or a physical therapist or something like that. the only way you're going to know what a PA is and what a PA does is shadowing a PA. And so that's why it's the most important, and it's more or less required for your application. Some schools will say they don't have um, shadowing hour requirements, but they'll just say it's highly encouraged. We say for students to be competitive, you want about 50 to 100 PA shadowing hours. So that's kind of it on that. I don't know if anyone, how do you recommend getting shadowing experience? How did you reach out to a PA? So that's also a great question. Shadowing experience is there's multiple ways to get it. The biggest, the best, the easiest way is just networking, like personal connections. My neighbor growing up was a PA, and so I shadowed her, and that was just how I was able to get them. And I know I'm very lucky, and that was pretty easy for me to get it. But other times, students will have there's like a lot of major health systems and like major, mostly academic centers will have shadowing programs for pre-PA students or for pre-health students, where within the institution you just sort of submit an application and you have to get accepted. So it is something that you have to apply for. But there's though that's definitely something to look into aside from the personal connections and just networking. Another thing is also, and this is probably the hardest thing, but is literally just like cold calling offices. I think like a lot of times, it doesn't yield like a lot of results, to be totally honest with you, but you can call, like if you look within your area that you live or where you guys go to school, just like primary care offices like in this area, and you can call and say, hey, do you guys employ any PAs? Are they open to taking shadows? Because you, as a shadow, you don't actually do anything with patients. You're not actually hands-on with them. And you literally are just observing the PA. You don't have to, necessarily need credentials, or there's not a lot of paperwork because you're literally just shadowing. So that's why cold calling, sometimes you can be lucky with it. It's definitely like not the best option, but that's another way that students have gotten PA shadowing hours before. I also think that within any of your clinical experiences, so any of you guys that are actively doing patient care experience, wherever you're doing that, if there are PAs in those offices or in those settings that you guys are working, you can always approach them and say, hey, I know I work as X, but I'm trying to go to PA school. Would there be any time that you have to let me shadow you for a day or so? And then that's kind of how you build the relationship, and continue on from there. A lot of students who are like EMTs, they'll be like, yeah, there's a ton of PAs that work in the hospital that we bring all the patients to, and I communicate with them all the time. And I'm like, okay, great. So like you already communicate with them, you already know them. Just ask them if you can shadow. And then they're like, oh, that's actually a great idea. I didn't know I could do that. So yeah, those are just some ideas for that. Um, any other questions about patient care experience or shadowing experience? And obviously, if you don't think of them now, but they come up later, you guys can always ask. But moving on to community service. So community service is one of those things that everyone will ask, like, how necessary is it? Because it's not required as a lot of patients or as a lot of schools prerequisites, or like on their website they won't actually say, like, in addition to all the classes and their GPA requirements and their hour requirements, they won't actually say X amount of volunteer hours or X amount of community service. But it is actually really important for your application, because a lot of when you get into kind of the more nitty gritty of the application and the school supplemental essays, as well as like even some of the interviews, schools want to know that their students are excited about and already involved in giving back to the community in whatever way you decide to do that. So a lot of students will do community service through their sorority or fraternity that they're in undergrad. A lot of people will work with like a church group or a religious group or community that they're involved in. Students will do community service with like sports teams that they're involved in, or different clubs on campus or whatever. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. It doesn't have to necessarily just be within the medical space. That being said, The biggest thing and something that schools love, love, love to have to that their students do is work in a free clinic. So I'm sure a lot of you are asking, how can I find a free clinic? Students ask me that all the time whenever I bring this up. And the easiest way to do it is just literally Google free clinic in my area or free clinic in whatever area you guys live at home and not when you're at school or whatever, wherever you're going to be spending your time. And then going to their websites and looking because most free clinics, because they're free and they're not employing people, um, and they can't pay people, they have volunteer opportunities. So even on their website, so you won't have, if you're nervous about cold calling people or whatever, you can go on their website and it'll say volunteer experience. Usually there's a little bit of an application that you have to submit, but because you're volunteering, because it's unpaid, most people get accepted to them. And there may be some like volunteer hour requirements. So you might have to work like they're very low. They're not like I've never seen like a really high hour requirement, but it might be like 4 hours a month or something where it's like one afternoon a month you do some volunteer hours in a free clinic. So then you're also kind of double dipping with like patient care experience and also volunteer work, which is good because it just obviously it's something that you're interested in. It's something that's going to get you good experience, but it's also you giving back to the community, working with underserved. And a lot of schools, that's going to be things in their mission statement, like wanting their students to work with underserved, wanting their students to be passionate about working with underserved communities, giving back to communities, et cetera. And so then you kind of have this leg up on other students, where you can talk about it in your supplementals, you can talk about it in your interviews, and it's also obviously on your resume too. So that is what I'll say about community service. And then leadership is also really any sort of leadership. It's also not required, but it's definitely definitely something that kind of boosts your application a little bit. A lot of students will do tutoring as leadership, or they're a TA for a class in college, or they were on a captain of the sports team, or held some position on a sports team, or held some position in a fraternity or sorority. So those are just some ideas of leadership. Other things too, if you're working as part of patient care experience, I've had students who have been a medical assistant, and then at some point in that job, they've become like a supervising medical assistant and like train new hires. So that would be an example of leadership in the clinical space and not just necessarily in school. So yeah, any questions about any of the data points or anything that we just went over? Again, if they come up later, feel free to interrupt me or just write them in the chat. So the next piece is going to be obviously CASPA. So CASPA, I'm sure you guys all know, it stands for Centralized Application. I don't know what the S stands for, but for physician assistant. And basically the picture on the right side is actually what your home screen of CASPA is going to look like. Like I said, I don't know where you guys are in your application process, if anyone's open to CASPA yet, but the screenshot on the right is what it's going to look like. And so it's broken down into 4 different buckets. So the personal information section is broken down into the demographic information, COVID essay, life experiences essay. The COVID essay and the life experiences essay we'll get into later in the PowerPoint as well. But the demographic information really just asks you like where you're from, about your parents, about their jobs, about their income, about a little like blurb of kind of the setting in which you grew up. So was it like urban, suburban, rural, like whatever. And you just write like a couple sentences about that. That's just they're not judging you on that information. It's really just for their websites and kind of for their admissions purposes. So that's personal information. And then the top right column is going to be the academic history. So your list of colleges. So for you guys, if you're just attending the one school that you attend and it's a 4-year college and that's the only place you've taken any of your prerequisites, you obviously just have one college listed. For other people who maybe, let's say, on a winter term, they take a class from a community college at home to fulfill a prerequisite, or they take a gap year and they're taking a lot of their classes at another school, whatever, to fill requirements, or maybe they go abroad and they're technically enrolled in another course, whatever. You have to list all the colleges that you ever took classes at, and then include those transcripts from those colleges. Um, so obviously, when you're including the transcripts, that includes your courses and your grades. And then that's where your GRE and your PA CAT scores go. For the GRE and the PA CAT, when you take the test, after you get your score, you have to, all of the PA schools that you're applying to have like a code that you then have to like request your scores be sent to that code. It costs, I think, like $10 per school to send it to. But it's easier and less confusing than I'm making it seem. But it just is kind of a formality thing. And when you're actually in CASPA, it details exactly how to do it. If I took a class at a community college, does it show up as a pass or as a grade to PA school? So it depends on how you were graded in that course. So if a class at a community college was graded pass fail, it would come up as pass fail. If it was graded as A, B, C, D, it would come up as that. So it's whatever the transcript says is how it would come up. Because again, you have to show proof of your transcripts. They have to be linked to your CASPA. So they would see it that way, however you were graded in the course. So then the bottom, wait, I didn't need to do that. Okay, so the bottom left is going to be supporting information. So that's going to be your references, your experiences and achievements, your certifications, and your personal statement. So your list of references, for the most part, it's required to have 3 letters of recommendation for PA school. One, if you're applying, mostly if you're able to, some students who apply like 5-7 years out of undergrad, this might not be feasible, but for any of you guys, if you're applying right out of undergrad or 1 year out, you're going to want to have a letter from a professor, preferably a science professor. The 2 is going to be from a PA, like I mentioned. The importance of shadowing is also obviously to learn, but also to have a reference. And so having one from a PA is very important. And then the third, sorry, did someone have a question? Okay, maybe not. So then the third is going to be from a boss or like a supervisor in either one of your clinical roles or in like another job that you had. If you feel like there's a different combination of those 3, that you feel like 2 professors and 1 PA, if you didn't work clinically or whatever, or you don't feel close to a science professor and you have 2 bosses that you want to have write a letter or in a PA, whatever, that is up to you guys. But that's kind of, those 3 would be like the best and what we would recommend to have your references from, because then someone can speak to you as a student and how you are in the classroom. Obviously the PA can speak to how you're going to be as a PA. And then the third, they can speak to you as an employee and how you are in the work setting, which obviously translates then into the clinical setting in PA school. So that's the list of references. Experiences and achievements. So that's going to be your experience descriptions. Like I mentioned, I forget whoever asked about the caregiver, if that counts as patient care hours. So that's where you're going to write out your experiences and be very detailed in what your tasks were. So you can actually get credit for your work. And again, we'll go into that a little bit more in detail in one of the later slides. Certifications are going to be like if you have an EMT license, a CNA license, BLS certified, CPR certified, whatever, all of that stuff is going to be in supporting information. None of that is required for your application, but they do, if you have any of those for whatever reason, they do give you a section to put it on the application. And then personal statement, which we'll get into as well. And then the bottom right corner is going to be program materials. So that's going to be school specific. So some schools have supplemental essays where you have to write more essays, more writing about why do you want to specifically attend our school? How do you feel like you would further our mission, or whatever the case is. Some schools have very obscure and like rogue questions. Other times it's mostly just like, why do you want to attend our school? And that's going to be the supplemental essays. Some schools don't have them, which is great, and you can just apply. Other schools just require like a resume, or sometimes there's like a list of questions that are just yes, no, or whatever. But every school is different for that stuff. Um, okay. So the personal statement. So obviously a lot of times, a lot of students, and I'm sure most of you on here, um, are asking, what should I write my personal statement about? How do I start my personal statement? What are they looking to get out of it? What am I supposed to do for my personal statement? And it's definitely challenging. I will say that it's hard because I feel like, in my opinion, up until this point, the only time you've ever written anything similar to this is for college admissions. And this is obviously very different. It's not supposed to be an English paper. It's not supposed to be like how you learn to write in high school or even college. It's very specific for admission to a medical graduate program. And so that's why the style of writing and kind of how to approach it is a little bit different. Um, so how we sort of guide students to think about how to start with the personal statement is, by the end of whoever's reading your personal statement, by the end of it, they want to be able to answer these questions. If they were like, they want to be able, if they had asked you these questions, you want to answer these questions in the essay. So question one being, how have your background and life experiences shaped your values? So up until this point, all the things that we've talked about in terms of like the data points and everything, for the most part, are going to be similar across the board for all students that are applying to PA school. Everyone that is going to want to get into a top PA school, or really any PA school, is going to have a strong GPA. They're going to have shadowing hours. They're going to have patient care experience. They're going to have good references. So all of those things are kind of the same. And so this is the opportunity that you have to differentiate yourself from other people. And so the background and life experiences, that's going to be the personal aspect that you're going to talk about, that's going to be different from other people. So you also, though, want to keep in mind that the background and life experiences and how they've shaped your values need to be related to, obviously, your reason and the purpose of you filling out this application and wanting to be a PA. So to give you guys an example of that, I had a student recently who I worked with who grew up playing competitive tennis. And she was super, that kind of, when she thought about her childhood, when she thought about her upbringing, that was like one of the biggest things that she felt consumed a lot of her time. And so she wrote about how her experience growing up playing competitive tennis taught her discipline, taught her a work ethic, taught her, obviously tennis is for the most part an individual sport, but there's some of like a teamwork aspect to it. And so talked about that. And so then kind of used all of those things as examples of things that she really values and things that she's then carried on into her academics, carried on into her patient care experiences, and plans to carry on also as a PA and as a PA student. And so that's kind of how she brought in that personal background, but also tied it into the purpose, like I said, of filling out this application of and answering the question that they ask of like, why do you think you're going to be a good PA? Or why do you want to be a PA? Kind of is, I think, along the lines of what the main question on CASPA is. So that's question one. Question two is going to be, how did you become interested in the PA profession? So obviously, like I said, you're applying to PA school, so this has to come up. Why you want to be a PA? How did you become interested in it? Needs to be part of the essay, and that's obviously pretty self-explanatory. Everyone has a different reason. Everyone has a different story as to how they came across the PA profession and why they feel like it's fitting most for them. Question three is going to be, how have your clinical experiences confirmed your passion for being a PA? So this one I feel like is where students sort of not miss the mark a little bit, but sort of don't know how to talk about direct patient care experiences and being specific. And I always work with students on their essays, and they'll send me a draft initially, and I'll be like, okay, this is good, but you need to be more specific about your actual involvement with patients, and then what you learned from those patients and how that will translate into you being a good PA. And so with the clinical experiences, you want to be very specific. So again, to give you guys an example of that, one of the things that I wrote about in my personal statement was in college, I worked in an emergency room in a trauma unit, and obviously as a student, you can't really do much. You can't really be super hands-on with patients, but at least in the role that I had, I wasn't able to. And so I had a patient, a trauma come in. It was a young girl who was in a car accident with her parents, and she hadn't been separated from them like ever, but she was in this scenario. They came in a different ambulance, whatever. I'm not sure the circumstances as to why that happened, but that is what happened. And so when she came in, she was essentially having a panic attack. She didn't know where they were, what had happened, why she was in the hospital. And then kind of because of she was getting herself so worked up, the nurses and doctors couldn't do what they needed to do to help her because she was like freaking out. So the doctor had said to me, go and just sit next to her and talk to her and explain to her what's happening. And so I literally just sat there and talked her through what was going on, gave her updates on where her parents were, what was happening, what had happened in the car accident, of what we had heard from the EMS, that the nurses needed to draw her blood. They needed to take her vitals. This was the test she was going to, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, I explained this in not as much of a long story in my essay, but then I talked about how the importance of obviously communication in healthcare, the importance of connecting with your patients and developing that trusting relationship to the point where she trusted me. And then we were able to do our jobs and get her help and get her the help that she needed. And so I laid that out. I laid those lessons out, and then I translated that into, I plan to do the same thing in my future as a PA. And I understand how important communication in healthcare is and all of that stuff. So that's how, and you want to give probably like 1 to 2 examples, like actual patient care examples like that, in your statement. And those examples obviously should be different and should have different lessons. So obviously you're not going to write two different patient examples, but with the same takeaway of communication in healthcare or of teamwork or of like teamwork collaboration or something like that, that you want them to be different. So that is going to be question 3. And then question 4 is going to be, what qualities have you learned through your journey that make you well suited for being a PI? So that's kind of in conjunction with the lessons learned. They kind of go hand in hand. The reason why there's a lot of overlap between these questions is you shouldn't approach it as like, okay, question 1 is going to be paragraph 1, question 2 is going to be paragraph 2, 3 and 4, and so on. The whole essay needs to be cohesive. It needs to all kind of blend together, make sense, and fully show your depth as an applicant and like everything that you have to offer. So the other qualities beyond just the clinical experiences, you can talk about leadership experiences, you can talk about volunteer experiences, you can talk about shadowing. So it doesn't have, there should be at least like 1 clinical experience, just because obviously that's so important in your application and for your growth and just your competitiveness as an applicant. But you can also talk about tutoring or being a TA or whatever the case is, and what lessons that role taught you, and how those are going to be applicable and make you well suited for being a PA as well. So it's not just clinical experiences. Obviously, you guys spend a lot of your time doing a lot of other things than just clinical experiences, and so that should also be reflected in your essay. Obviously, as a balance, but. And then the conclusion, it's not on here, but that always should just be kind of very short, very sweet, just like looking ahead to the future, sort of giving. I always help students and advise students that in their conclusion, they really want to be super confident about what their next steps are, confident that they're ready and willing and able to take on the next challenge of going to PA school. And if you end with that confident note and you end in that way, I think that will really rub off on whoever is reading it. And it will make them feel more confident in you and more confident to give you an interview and ultimately, if you do well in the interview, accept you. So that's why I always think the conclusion should be kind of short and sweet and confident and looking to the future is kind of my direction on that. So anyone have any questions about the personal statement? So this is what I was talking about with the experience descriptions. Um, this is what it's actually going to look like on Caspa. So this is like a screenshot from it. You're going to put your title. So we can use the example of the caregiver. So here you would literally write caregiver and whatever, if it was for an adult, if it was for a child or whatever kind of whoever it was for, you're going to write that in as your title. Compensated, academic credit, volunteer, whatever, average weekly hours, number of weeks, and then that calculates your total hours. In this description and key responsibilities, this is where you want to be very specific into what you do on a day-to-day. So obviously, because a caregiver could really mean so many things, were you like basically acting as a CNA where you were dressing the patient, feeding the patient, toileting the patient? Like, how involved were you in their care? Or were you a caregiver and you were like running errands for someone or like prepping meals, but not actually helping them feed or whatever? Like, I don't know exactly what anyone is doing, but in here, you want to be very specific on your key responsibilities, because this is where they see it and they say, okay, she was a caregiver, but she really did the work as a CNA, like of a CNA. And so these hours are very valuable and should be counted towards patient care experience. And so that the next slide, I think it is, where we talk more specifically about what to include in the experience descriptions, but the key responsibilities is where you're going to write all of that out. It's not going to be a list. It's going to be actually in paragraph format, and you only have 600 characters. So you want to be cohesive, but like concise in what you say. And because you want to make sure you get credit for everything you did, but are within that character limit, obviously. And then you always want to say yes to, can they contact your organization? It just looks shady if you say no, honestly. But who knows if they actually contact the organization? I'm not sure. So this is how you want to fill out the experience description. So step one is you're going to describe the clinic, you're going to describe the organization or the program in which you did it. I'll use my example of being a CNA. So I worked as a CNA in an inpatient rehab facility for some of my clinical hours. And so I would describe the facility and say, like, it was called Burke Rehabilitation. I would say Burke Rehabilitation is a inpatient rehab facility that treats patients aged 65 to 90, whatever, or treats patients after suffering from a knee replacement, hip replacement, total joint replacement, whatever was the majority of what your patients were or had experienced. If you were both part-time and full-time at the same job, how do you input that in the hours portion? What you can do with that, and I think this is what I ended up doing, is if you know the total number of hours that you worked, you can basically just calculate it yourself. And like, let's say, I'm bad at math, but let's say it's like 40 hours total. You can say you worked 4 hours a day for 10 weeks. I think that math checks out. But whatever. So and you can say that you were full-time, or you can say you were part-time, or when you were full-time and part-time and you had different roles, you can make them two separate experience descriptions. You obviously, with any role that you do, you want to do a separate experience description. But in terms of part-time and full-time, I think you can just do the total number of hours and make the math work out that way. Because that would be fine, and then you're still getting credit for all the hours that you did. So back to the experience description. So step 2, you're going to explain why you got involved is optional. You don't have to say why you got involved. Like I mentioned, you only have 600 characters, and so you want to be very mindful of what you're actually writing and how you're using those characters. The why you got involved. The other reason why it's optional is because I think the obvious why you got involved is because you need hours to apply to PA school. And so that's why it's sort of optional, because you don't need to say that that's why you got involved. So step 3, you're going to describe your tasks in detail. So this is where I was mentioning, you want to be very specific. So like I said, toileting, bathing, feeding, all of that stuff needs to be included in your description, and you need to be specific in what you did, in logical order, just so it's easy and like kind of cohesive and concise for them to read. For step 3. And how long would an ideal personal statement be? So the personal statement, the character limit is 5,000 characters, for the personal statement. The COVID essay and the life experiences essay, which we'll get to, those character limits are 2,500 characters. So a little bit half of the personal statement. So yeah, I think it's about two pages double spaced, maybe 2.5. When you submit it, it'll be single space. But I'm pretty sure it's 2.5 double space, which would be a little over 1 single spaced. But yeah, those are the character limits for those. And then step 4 for the experience descriptions. If there's room, describe what you learned from the experience and how it helped you grow. So an example of that would be if you're working as a medical assistant in an office, with PAs, with nurses, with doctors, you can and you have space to include, like, from your 600 characters, you can mention, this environment taught me the importance of teamwork, or whatever, something like that. Again, if you have room to write something. So that is an overview of the experience descriptions. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay. So the COVID essay, I'm not sure. I was asked by a student recently that, do I think that the COVID essay is going to be around for several more years? I don't know, is my answer. They obviously started the COVID essay, I'm pretty sure 2 years ago, so 2022 application cycle. And the question is going to be, describe how COVID impacted you personally, professionally, and academically, on your journey to becoming a PA. So it's pretty self-explanatory. You just divide up your essay in the 3 paragraphs. So a paragraph about how it affected you academically, a paragraph about how it affected you personally, and a paragraph how it affected you professionally. You want to obviously present facts and events that impacted your performance. You don't want to, obviously everyone was affected by COVID. So you want to be honest about your experience and how it, in the extent that it impacted you. And then how things would be different had COVID not occurred. So a lot of people, obviously, a lot of classes went online. When academically, classes went online, you had to do Zoom study sessions. You weren't in a classroom with classmates collaborating on things. Professionally, a lot of students, shadowing things got taken away from them, or patient care experiences looked a little bit different because of social distancing and whatnot. So you want to explain how the extent of that and how things would have been different. You want to obviously show with this, like, your ability to adapt, your ability to grow from kind of these obstacles and changes, and how you feel like this sort of adversity is only going to make you better working in healthcare and make you a stronger PA. You want to definitely give it a positive spin, and you don't want to make excuses for anything within the COVID essay, obviously, because, like I said, everyone was affected by COVID. So you don't want to say, hey, COVID, I got taken off of my my shadowing experience, and so that's why I don't have shadowing experience, or my grades aren't that great for my first 2 years because it was COVID and I couldn't learn in person, or something. Like, you don't want to make excuses for that. But you just want to sort of present the facts and then talk about adaptability and growth, and kind of how COVID will make you stronger in healthcare as a PA ultimately. When we are filling out the experience description, should we write it in first person point of view or third person? So first person point of view. So you want to use, like, I statements. So I helped toilet the patient, I helped walk the patient, or I helped do therapy with the patient, whatever. So yeah, first person point. That's a good question. So the life experiences essay. So this is the other essay on CASPA. That's not obviously the COVID or the personal statement. It's 2,500 characters. This is a new essay that they came up with in the application this year. The prompt for this one is going to be explain how your life experiences and perspectives could contribute to the PA profession. How can these experiences help advance the goal of having healthcare providers who reflect the population of the country? Um, it's a new essay. I personally don't really like it, to be honest with you, but you have to do it, so we'll talk about it. So for this one as well, you want to separate it into three different paragraphs. Paragraph one, explaining one to two key life experiences that give you relevant perspective. So to give you two examples that are a little bit different, I had one student that I worked with who she had written about her main life experience that was super impactful for her. And one of the reasons why she wants to be a PA is she grew up in an abusive household and her dad would abuse her mom. And her mom didn't really have a voice and didn't really have a never really would speak up for herself. And so when this student grew up a little bit and was in high school, she sort of realized how to find her own voice. And because when she was younger, because her mom was sort of silenced, like she also felt like she needed to be. And so she found her own voice a little bit and then really kind of became an advocate for her mom and became an advocate for herself and talked just about how she wants to be an advocate for people that don't have a voice. And a lot of times in healthcare, a lot of people don't because either their health literacy is poor or they don't have resources or whatever the case is. And so then she talked about how she wants to be a PA to advocate for patients, especially patients in underserved communities, especially patients where maybe there's a language barrier or a lack of resources or what, like I said, whatever the case is, and then talked a lot about how advocacy is so important, but also communication in healthcare is so important. And speaking up and things like that, and educating their patients on everything and giving them sort of the power and autonomy to speak up and that they have the power to do that if they have all the information and all of that stuff. So that was one example of a student who I thought did really well with this question and had a really good life experiences essay. And then another student that I worked with also, he wrote about growing up in I'm realizing too, these two examples that I'm giving you are also about like young childhood, and that doesn't always have to be kind of where you look to for this essay. You also don't want to write about something that you wrote about in your personal statement. So you want to diversify the different essays so that they're really, like I said, giving a full approach and a complete application at the end of kind of when they review it. But this other student, he wrote about growing up in a household where substance abuse was very prevalent and that kind of permeated into his upbringing and his life and everything. And so he talked about then how that sort of has wanted or kind of given him the desire to work in the mental health space, work in the addiction medicine, and how he has seen how addiction and mental health can sort of affect anyone, any person, in any background, any walk of life. And so that kind of is his drive to being a PA, and it kind of is a way that he connected it to reflecting the population of the country where he can treat anyone or anyone can be affected by this, and he'll have the tools and kind of experience to be effective in caring for them. So just two examples. A lot of people or a lot of students are like, well, what does life experience really mean? Like, what am I supposed to talk about? And so those are just two examples. So paragraph one is going to be laying out the experience. Paragraph two is going to be explaining how the lessons learned from that experience are applicable to the PA profession, like those two examples I mentioned. And how each experience and lessons learned would allow you to contribute to creating a healthcare workforce that reflects the population of the country. So kind of in the second example that I gave you, that third paragraph piece he hit on that a little bit in terms of the fact that like mental health can affect anyone, addiction can affect anyone. and how that's obviously very prevalent across the country. So that is the life experiences essay. And that is the end of my presentation. This is the contact information slide. I'll leave it up here for a little bit if you guys want to write it down, jot the number down, jot the email down, whatever. We do offer free 20-minute consultations with Ali, who he's kind of the main person of Admission Helpers. And basically, he kind of will review things with you, kind of see what you're looking for, what your goals are, what your timeline is, review a little bit of your application and kind of your academic history and things like that, and give you some suggestions of like where you can improve upon. I work directly with students on the application process. So in a very, there's obviously a huge range, like the packages or things are completely customizable. So like if you only want help on the personal statement, or you only want help with the primary application, so just the personal statement, experience descriptions, life experiences essay, and COVID essay, there's packages for that. If you just want help on interview prep, if you just want strategy consultation, like whatever it is, he is very accommodating with students. And we've worked with a lot of students. So, but again, the phone call to just kind of hear him out and get the information that you want, or any additional questions that you want answered, he's available, and that is the email and the phone number. I think I'm not actually sure about the phone number, or like if it's an office phone or whatever. He's very responsive via email, so I feel like that if you have any specific questions, that's probably your better bet. And then you guys can set up a time to chat. But beyond that, we have about 8 minutes left. What other questions do you guys have? I'm also done presenting, so I can stop sharing my screen. And if you guys want to unmute and ask your questions, whatever you guys want, whatever works for you.
I have a quick question. When it comes down to your letters of recommendation, is it just like a baseline three, or can we submit more than three, or is it like overwhelming if we submit more than three?
So that's a good question. 3 is the minimum. I think the maximum is 5. I personally think it's probably overwhelming to submit more than 3, because if you do, then you have to, like, most schools only review 3. I think it's an outlier if they review more than that. So if you are linking more recommendations to your CASPA more than 3, then you have to like decide which ones you want them to look at. So it's sort of counterintuitive of like getting that extra one, because then it's not even looked at in some cases. So that's kind of how I would answer that question. I saw a question in the chat. So do you have an estimate of how long an average person takes to create a personal statement? I would imagine that I would take like day breaks or so to go back with a fresh mind and proofreading. Yeah. So for like, I've worked for months on the personal statement with students. I would say a couple months is like the average that it takes. Cause obviously, like I mentioned, I work clinically in addition to doing this. So we're not meeting every day. Students will kind of work on it. Then we'll meet, we'll kind of review it. We'll talk about different ideas, brainstorm maybe some new ideas, and then kind of go back and forth like that. And so it's definitely not something that is done in a day or 2 days even. It's a process, and it's the first thing I usually work on with students, because it does take the longest, because it should take the longest. It's the most, I think, important of the essays that you're going to write for your application. Do you have a timeline you suggest to start applications taking GRE, doing the essays before the application opens? I think it depends on kind of your goals and your timeline goals. I applied my junior year of college because I did not want to take a gap year. So I submitted my applications in April of that year. And I think I probably started working on them in the fall semester, like very loosely, I would say. I probably studying for the GRE obviously takes a little bit of time depending on what type of test taker you are. And the personal statement, like I said, takes a couple months with depending on the type of writer you are, and then also how much editing and going back you need to do with it. Also, obviously, the other essays take a little bit of time, and there's more essays now than when I applied. I did not have to do a COVID essay or a life experiences essay. I was just the personal statement. So there's a little bit more now, but yeah, April is when CASPA opens, and I would say starting like that fall semester gives you enough like ample time to not be like rushing and to submit your applications early. Yeah, no problem.
Does anyone else have any last minute questions?
I will stop sharing my screen then, but we still have a couple minutes if anyone has questions about anything, even just being a PA. Obviously, I'm sure you guys have questions about the application process more at this point, but yeah, open to really any questions.
Okay, awesome. Well, I have your email and I see some people are starting to head out, so I can always just give them that if they have any other questions.
Just
And
one, there was
everyone,
one in the chat. Sorry, there was just one in the chat. Anything to
yeah.
include when asking for a letter of recommendation? So that's actually a really good question also. I always recommend to students to include their personal statement and a resume into when you're asking for a letter of recommendation, because obviously you're asking someone that knows you personally. You're asking someone that has obviously some background of why you're going to PA school and what classes you're taking or whatever, but the personal statement really gives them that why do you want to be a PA answer, and so they can go off of that to write your recommendation. And then also your resume kind of includes everything that you do. Obviously some of your professors probably don't know exactly all the extracurriculars that you do or what else you've been involved in, so that is why I would include that, because that kind of they can talk about any of that stuff and sort of add in different things that they might not otherwise know about you. So that is that. I think also when you're asking for letters of recommendation, if you like, let's say you're in class now, but you're only a junior and you're planning on taking a year off, but you were like in a really good class that you like and like the professor you're really excited about and you kind of bond with them well, you can always just ask them for like the best contact email at the end of the semester, at the end of the class, to then have and like reach out the following year about it or something. Because obviously until you open your CASPA and submit their contact information, you can't like upload the recommendations yourself. So it's good to have those contact informations as well.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Yeah.
Any last minute questions, guys? Okay, I think, yeah, seems like we're all set. Thank you so much, Nora, for coming and
Yeah,
speaking
of course.
up today. I thought today's presentation was great. And yeah, hopefully you guys have some people coming over soon. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Awesome. Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, have a good night, guys.
Bye.